All right, guys, so for today, our goal is to try to get our study guide finished up. We'll start with religion in the afterlife. A lot of what we've discussed and talked about and seen already does kind of show how the Egyptians had this very strong belief that there was a life after they pass away. We saw how our pharaohs are going to be buried with possessions, and their body was going to be mummified and preserved in such a way that it could be used again in this afterlife. So I do have this very strong belief. Now, common people in Egypt were not buried in elaborate tombs or anything like that, but most people were going to get some form of mummification. Even your poorest people would get the best that they could afford because they thought that's what was going to help them get to that afterlife. So we already mentioned a little bit about our mummification. But the other part with religion and how that ties into the afterlife has to do with their temples and their gods and goddesses. The Egyptians lived in such a way where they were very fearful of the gods. So they thought that their gods needed to be worshipped and kept happy. So a lot of temples were built to help worship those gods. A lot of them were dedicated to major gods like Re and Horus, Osiris, Anubis. But others were built in areas where they were just kind of for their local gods. If you remember, we spoke earlier how, there's thousands of different gods in ancient Egypt, all of them with different backstories and, very elaborate tales of how they came to be. Others are pretty minor and were only worshipped in certain parts of Egypt. So to go along with that, with your temples and things, obviously we know our pharaohs had temples built to honor them, because remember they thought they were related to the gods. But with our temples, ordinary people did not gather there. Only your priests and pharaohs were allowed inside the actual temples. Your ordinary citizen in ancient Egypt worshipped outside of them. They usually built these smaller temples outside or buildings where they could worship and not have to interact with that pharaoh or the priest. So the next couple slides here, we're going to see some pictures of some of these temples that are still around. Now, as we look at these, I kind of want you to remember that, they're built roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years ago by people who didn't have any power tools or heavy machinery or anything like that. So, even if you look here, you've got really elaborate hieroglyphics carved into the stone, and the height of these statues outside this building are carved into the stone also. So, the amount of talent or ability it took to build these things is pretty incredible, considering how long ago it happened and how few materials and resources the people actually had. And again, if you look close, you can see the hieroglyphics here on these columns. Now, obviously, this is a modern day picture here. You can see this temple for Hatshepsut. People can go visit it today. It is open to tourism. Now, about the gods and goddesses a little bit. With our readings that we've done, we've already kind of talked about those a little bit. And we saw some of these on some of the different tombs that we looked at in class also. So hopefully by now you know that this is the god Horus. He is usually shown with a man's body and the head of a falcon. And this guy we've seen multiple times also. This is the god Osiris. He was the god of death in the afterlife. He's very, very visible in all the different tombs that have been discovered throughout ancient Egypt. But he's always depicted as a man with green skin. If you remember that video we watched in class earlier this week, where It told the origin story of Osiris, how he was dead, and his wife Isis tried to bring him back from the afterlife, and all of that explains why he has that green skin. Another god that was very important in ancient Egypt was Anubis. When we do our mummification demonstration, we'll talk about him a little bit more in depth. But he was obviously one of the more important gods just because of how important mummification was to the Egyptians. You could often see pictures of him depicted on different tomb walls. But if you look at this particular tomb painting here, hopefully this bed looks a little familiar to you. We saw one very similar in King Tut's tomb. And then hopefully you notice these canopic jars that are below. We've talked about those a couple times now already. But for Anubis and mummification, usually when mummification took place, one of the priests or one of the embalmers that were performing the embalming and mummification would often dress as Anubis. Usually involves some type of a jackal type headdress and painting of the skin. Now, Re is another god that we've talked about a couple times as well. Re is often drawn as sometimes just this simple red disc. Remember, they thought he was the sun god. So he's sometimes drawn with just this red disc. Other times he's this red disc that looks like Horus also. Has the same human body with a falcon head. Now, if you notice the girl here next to him, that is the god Isis. All right, so our next couple slides are just kind of putting the finishing touches on some of the different things with ancient Egypt. We'll go to more in depth with this stuff later on. Like I said, these last few slides are just kind of get our study guides finished up. And like I said, we'll go into more in detail later. But just like the Sumerians, our Egyptians did have a writing style. If you remember with the Sumerians, they used that cuneiform. So it was that very triangle, wedge-shaped looking writing that was done in clay. The Egyptians used a style of writing called hieroglyphics. It is more pictures used to symbolize words or phrases. But here are a couple different examples of hieroglyphics. If you look closely, you can definitely make out what some of these things are. So you have an eye here. There are several different versions of birds. This symbol represents the Nile River. Here's a little close-up of that. You've got rope knotted. You've got a lion here. Like I said, there's thousands of these different symbols. And we'll go into more in depth with them too. All right, so we have a couple things left on your study guide here. We've kind of answered this stuff as we've gone through the PowerPoint and gone over and talked about things. This is just kind of a way to get it all on one slide for you to look at so you know exactly where to write it. So for question number 14 on your study guide was, how did a belief in an afterlife affect the culture of the Egyptians? So there's several things here. Because of that belief in an afterlife, they mummified their dead. They tried to keep the bodies preserved for that afterlife. They're also going to bury the dead with their possessions so that they can take them with them. They worshipped many different gods. They built pyramids and tombs for their pharaohs so that they had a place to live in the afterlife, or a place that they could still be worshipped after they were gone. And then the building of temples for the gods and their pharaohs. And then finally, we had 3 questions to finish up the study guide. Obviously, why did the Egyptians build the pyramids? As a place to bury and worship their pharaoh after their death. On what continent would we find Egypt? It's obviously in Africa. And lastly, number 6, this is a review question. You probably didn't need to see it again, you probably already knew the answer to it. But irrigation is simply the process of bringing water to dry land.